in the sterile corridors of Riverside Medical Center. While doctors rushed to save a child's life during a critical hospital lockdown, no one expected the woman mopping the floors to suddenly take command, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority that once commanded 50,000 troops. "This is General Hartwell. I'm taking operational control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the pediatric intensive care unit as chaos erupted throughout Riverside Medical Center. A devastating cyberattack had crippled the hospital's entire network, life support systems flickering between operational and failure, security doors randomly locking and unlocking, and most critically, the medication dispensing systems had gone completely offline. In the midst of this digital nightmare, 8-year-old Timothy Rodriguez lay unconscious in room 314, his small body fighting a rare autoimmune condition that required precise medication timing every 4 hours. Without the computerized systems, the medical staff couldn't access his treatment protocols, and his condition was rapidly deteriorating. Nurse practitioner James Caldwell frantically tried to manually override the medication vault, his hands shaking as sweat beaded on his forehead. "I can't get into the pharmacy systems," he called out to Dr. Rachel Montgomery, the attending physician who was simultaneously trying to coordinate with 3 other critical patients whose monitors had gone dark. "Timothy's glucose levels are crashing, and without his immunosuppressant cocktail in the next 20 minutes, we're looking at organ failure." The emergency generators had kicked in, but the backup power wasn't sufficient to restore the complex computer networks that modern hospitals relied on for literally everything. The hospital's chief of security, Frank Delacroix, was on his radio trying to coordinate with the IT department, but the news was grim. "The entire tri-state medical network is down," he reported grimly to anyone within earshot. "This isn't just us. This is a coordinated attack on medical infrastructure. FBI is calling it a national security incident." In the corner of the hallway, barely noticed by the rushing medical staff, a slight woman in her late 40s continued methodically mopping the already clean floors. Jasmine Hartwell had been working the night shift as a custodial worker for exactly 6 months and 2 days. To everyone at Riverside Medical, she was simply Jazz, the quiet cleaning lady who always arrived early, worked efficiently, and never complained about the long hours or difficult working conditions. She had a gentle demeanor with patients, often sharing encouraging words in accented English that suggested she might be an immigrant working to support her family. Her supervisor, Linda Torres, had noted in her file that Jazz was reliable but unremarkable, the kind of employee who blended into the background of the hospital's daily operations. What none of them knew was that Jasmine Hartwell was actually General Jasmine Catherine Hartwell, United States Army, retired, a 3-star general who had spent 28 years in military service, including 6 years as the commanding officer of the Army's largest medical logistics operation. She had coordinated medical evacuations in 3 combat zones, overseeing the medical care of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and had been personally responsible for implementing crisis management protocols that had saved countless lives under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. She had also been the architect of the Army's cybersecurity defense protocols for medical systems, protocols that she had developed after witnessing firsthand how vulnerable digital medical infrastructure could be to hostile attacks. In her final military role, she had been the Pentagon's senior advisor on medical emergency preparedness, specializing in exactly the kind of coordinated cyberattack that was now crippling hospitals across the region. As she listened to the increasingly desperate conversations around her, Jazz recognized the attack signature immediately. This wasn't random, it was a sophisticated multi-vector assault designed to create maximum chaos in medical facilities. The pattern of system failures, the timing of the backup system overrides, and the specific targeting of medication and life support systems all pointed to a state-sponsored attack that she had wargamed with her team just 2 years before her retirement. Young Timothy's heart monitor began emitting the sharp, urgent beeps that indicated cardiac distress. Dr. Montgomery's voice cracked with stress as she called out, "His blood pressure is dropping fast. I need that medication now, or we're going to lose him." The child's mother, Rosa Rodriguez, who had been maintaining a brave face for hours, finally broke down sobbing in the corner, her husband Carlos holding her as they watched their son's condition deteriorate in real time. Jazz paused in her mopping, her trained eye assessing the tactical situation with the precision of a military commander evaluating a battlefield. She could see that the medical staff, despite their expertise and dedication, were operating without the strategic framework necessary to manage a coordinated infrastructure attack. They were treating this as a series of separate technical problems, rather than recognizing it as the unified assault it actually was. Each department was working in isolation, which was exactly what the attackers had designed the cyberattack to accomplish. The moment of decision arrived when she heard Dr. Montgomery whisper to Nurse Caldwell, "I don't think we can save him. Without the computer systems, I can't even verify what medications might interact badly. I'm flying blind here, and one mistake could kill him faster than the disease." Jazz set down her mop bucket with deliberate precision. She had spent 6 months in deep cover, investigating reports of potential security vulnerabilities in civilian medical infrastructure, a classified mission that required her to understand these systems from the ground up. Her cover as a custodial worker had given her access to every corner of the hospital, every security protocol, and every backup system. She had been gathering intelligence on exactly how vulnerable these facilities were to the kind of attack that was now unfolding. But this was no longer about intelligence gathering. This was about a child's life hanging in the balance. And she had the knowledge and authority to save him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She walked calmly to the central nurse's station, her posture subtly shifting from the slightly hunched demeanor of a tired custodial worker to the straight-backed bearing of a military officer. When she spoke, her voice carried a tone of absolute command authority that made every person in the corridor immediately stop what they were doing and turn toward her. "Dr. Montgomery," she said, her voice cutting through the medical chaos with surgical precision, "step back from the patient. Nurse Caldwell, I need you to manually access the backup pharmaceutical vault using emergency protocol 7 Alpha 9. Security Chief Delacroix, establish a direct line to Fort Braxton Medical Command immediately." The corridor fell into stunned silence. Dr. Montgomery stared at her in confusion. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "You're the cleaning lady. You can't just..." Jazz pulled a worn military identification card from her pocket, the movement practiced and smooth. "Dr. Montgomery, my name is General Jasmine Hartwell, United States Army Medical Command, retired. I've been conducting a classified assessment of civilian medical infrastructure vulnerabilities. This attack is following a pattern I've seen before, and I know exactly how to counter it. That child is going to die unless you follow my instructions right now." The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The quiet custodial worker who had mopped floors and emptied trash cans for 6 months had vanished, replaced by a seasoned military commander who had saved lives in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. And in that moment, as Timothy Rodriguez's heart monitor continued its urgent warning, everyone in that corridor realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. The general had just revealed herself, and the real mission was about to begin. For 6 months and 2 days, Jasmine Hartwell had been invisible, She arrived at Riverside Medical Center every evening at 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes before her midnight shift officially began, carrying the same worn canvas bag and wearing the same faded blue custodial uniform that had been issued to her on her first day. She clocked in with her employee ID badge number 3847, J. Hartwell, Custodial Services, and began her rounds with the methodical precision that her supervisor, Linda Torres, had come to expect from her most reliable night shift worker. The transformation had been deliberate and complete. Gone was the commanding presence that had once briefed senators and coordinated multi-billion-dollar military operations. In its place was a soft-spoken woman who spoke with a slight accent, carefully crafted to suggest someone for whom English was a second language. Someone who might be working night shifts to support family back home. She had practiced this persona for months before taking the assignment, studying the mannerisms and speech patterns of hardworking immigrants who formed the backbone of America's essential service workforce. Her daily routine was a masterpiece of mundane predictability. She started each shift in the pediatric ward, where she moved quietly between rooms, emptying trash bins and mopping floors with a thoroughness that impressed the nursing staff. The children loved her. She had a gentle way of smiling at them when their parents weren't looking, sometimes humming soft melodies that seemed to calm even the most restless patients. To the medical staff, she was simply Jazz, the cleaning lady who never complained about difficult messes and always seemed to anticipate what needed to be done. Dr. Montgomery had once commented to her colleague, "That new night cleaner is a godsend. You never have to ask her twice to clean up something unpleasant, and she's so good with the kids. I think she might have children of her own." The truth was more complex. General Hartwell had indeed been a mother, but her daughter Sarah had died in a terrorist attack on a military family housing complex 8 years prior. An event that had ultimately shaped her current mission in ways that no one at the hospital could have imagined. Jazz's lunch breaks were spent alone in the hospital cafeteria, where she would sit at a corner table with a simple sandwich and a thermos of coffee, quietly observing the flow of hospital operations. To casual observers, she appeared to be reading romance novels on a worn tablet, but she was actually studying detailed schematics of the hospital security systems, medication storage protocols, and emergency procedures. Her trained eye cataloged vulnerabilities that would make a security consultant weep: unsecured access points, outdated cybersecurity protocols, and backup systems that hadn't been properly tested in years. The other custodial staff had accepted her as one of their own. Maria Santos, who worked the day shift, would often chat with Jazz during shift changes, sharing stories about her grandchildren and asking Jazz about her family. Jazz had created an entire fictional backstory. She was supposedly supporting an elderly mother in Philadelphia and sending money to help with medical bills. The lie came easily because it was emotionally true. She was indeed supporting someone vulnerable, though her mission was protecting thousands of someones rather than just one. "You work too hard, Mia," Maria would often tell her. "You should find a better job, something that uses your brain more. You're too smart to be cleaning floors forever." Jazz would simply smile and shrug, saying in her carefully practiced accent, "Work is work. I'm grateful to have it." The irony was profound. She was arguably the most overqualified custodial worker in medical history. But this mission required her to be overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten. Her supervisor, Linda Torres, had been initially skeptical of Jazz's performance. "She's too perfect," Linda had confided to the hospital's human resources director during Jazz's 3-month review. "Nobody is that reliable, that thorough, and that uncomplaining. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." But as months passed without incident, Linda had relaxed into appreciating what she saw as simply good fortune in hiring. Jazz never called in sick, never argued about assignments, and somehow managed to clean areas more thoroughly than workers who had. Been there for years. What Linda didn't know was that Jazz's thoroughness came from military training that had taught her to notice everything. As she mopped floors, she was memorizing the locations of every security camera, every emergency exit, every backup power source. When she cleaned the administrative offices, she observed which computers were left logged in, which file cabinets were improperly secured, and which staff members had written their passwords on sticky notes attached to their monitors. Her custodial cart had been specially modified with hidden compartments containing surveillance, equipment, and emergency communication devices that looked like ordinary cleaning supplies. The hardest part of maintaining her cover wasn't the physical labor. General Hartwell had always believed in leading by example and was no stranger to hard work. The challenge was suppressing her instincts when she witnessed inefficiencies and security lapses that could cost lives. During her third week, she had watched a nurse accidentally nearly administer the wrong medication to a patient due to a labeling error that could have been prevented with proper protocols. Every fiber of her military training screamed at her to intervene, to implement immediate corrective measures, to prevent future incidents through systematic reform. Instead, she had quietly alerted the nurse to double-check the medication label, speaking up just enough to prevent harm while maintaining her cover as a concerned but untrained observer. "Excuse me, miss," she had said softly. "I think maybe that patient's bracelet says different name." The nurse had looked closer, realized the error, and thanked Jazz profusely for her attention to detail. The incident had been reported and corrected, but Jazz knew that without systematic changes, similar errors would continue to occur. Her small apartment near the hospital was as carefully constructed as her work persona. The single-bedroom unit was furnished with items from thrift stores and discount retailers, decorated with the kind of personal touches that suggested a life of modest means and simple pleasures. Family photos on the refrigerator showed people who were actually fellow soldiers from her military career, but to any casual observer, they looked like the extended family of an immigrant worker. Her closet contained only the clothing appropriate for her cover identity, simple, practical clothes that a custodial worker might wear, hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom closet. However, was equipment that would have impressed a CIA operative. Encrypted communication devices, detailed intelligence files, and emergency supplies that could sustain her for weeks if her cover was blown. Most importantly, she maintained a secure connection to her handler at the Pentagon, Colonel Rebecca Nash, who received daily reports on Jazz's observations about civilian medical infrastructure vulnerabilities. The mission had been designed to last exactly 1 year. General Hartwell was supposed to complete her assessment of hospital security weaknesses, compile a comprehensive report, and return to her consulting role with the Department of Defense. She had volunteered for this deep cover assignment after her daughter's death, had left her questioning whether the military was doing enough to protect civilian targets that could be vulnerable to terrorist attacks or hostile nation-state actions. But as she had grown to genuinely care about the staff and patients at Riverside Medical Center, the mission had become more personal. These weren't just data points in a security assessment. They were real people whose lives could be saved or lost based on the recommendations in her final report. Dr. Montgomery's dedication to her young patients, Nurse Caldwell's gentle bedside manner, and even Maria Santos's grandmother, wisdom had all become precious to her in ways that complicated her professional objectivity. She had been particularly drawn to the pediatric ward, where children faced medical challenges with a bravery that reminded her of young soldiers under fire. There was something about their resilience that honored the memory of her daughter Sarah while simultaneously healing wounds that military counselors had been unable to touch. In quiet moments between cleaning tasks, she would sometimes stand in the hallway and watch the children sleep, their small bodies connected to machines that kept them alive. And she would renew her commitment to ensuring that their protection was as robust as any military installation. Her cover identity had become so complete that she sometimes caught herself thinking in Jazz's voice rather than her own. The persona had developed its own habits, preferences, and relationships that felt increasingly real. She genuinely looked forward to her brief conversations with Maria, honestly cared about the recovery of specific patients, and had developed a real affection for the dedicated medical staff who worked tirelessly to save lives with inadequate resources and outdated security protocols. But beneath the carefully constructed ordinary exterior, General Jasmine Hartwell remained vigilant, analytical, and prepared. She knew that her true test would come not during the quiet routine of her nightly cleaning rounds, but in a moment of crisis when lives would depend on someone with the knowledge and authority to take decisive action. She had spent her entire military career preparing for such moments, and she understood that all of her training, all of her sacrifice, and all of her careful planning might ultimately be judged by a single moment when the ordinary world would demand extraordinary leadership. That moment was now less than 24 hours away. Though Jazz, the custodial worker, continued her rounds, humming softly as she mopped the pediatric ward floors, unaware that tomorrow night would shatter her carefully constructed ordinary world forever. The classified personnel file buried deep within Pentagon archives told a story that would have stunned every person who had watched Jazz quietly mop hospital floors for the past 6 months. Born Jasmine Catherine Hartwell in rural Montana, she had been the daughter of a small-town veterinarian and a high school mathematics teacher. Her childhood had been unremarkable except for one defining characteristic: an almost supernatural ability to organize chaos into order, and to see solutions where others saw only problems. At 17, she had witnessed a devastating multi-car accident on Highway 89 during a winter blizzard. While other bystanders panicked or stood frozen, young Jasmine had immediately begun triaging the injured, directing traffic around the accident scene, and coordinating the arrival of emergency services with a calm authority that had impressed the first responders. The state trooper who filed the incident report had written, "Civilian female, approximately 17 years old, demonstrated exceptional crisis management skills. Recommend consideration for emergency services training." That recommendation had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Within 6 months, she had enlisted in the Army, drawn by the promise of training that would allow her to save lives on a larger scale. Her aptitude scores had been extraordinary, but it was her performance under pressure that had caught the attention of her superior officers. During basic training, when a live-fire exercise had gone wrong and resulted in actual casualties, Private Hartwell had spontaneously taken command of the medical evacuation, coordinating with medics and directing the rescue of wounded soldiers with a precision that had earned her immediate promotion and assignment to advanced leadership training. Her rise through military ranks had been meteoric and unprecedented. By age 25, she was a captain leading medical logistics operations in the Balkans conflict, where she had developed revolutionary protocols for battlefield medical evacuation that had reduced combat mortality rates by 37%. Her innovations had been studied and implemented across NATO forces, earning her recognition as one of the most promising young officers of her generation. Major Hartwell's defining moment had come during the Iraq War, when a coordinated attack on a forward operating base had resulted in mass casualties and the complete breakdown of traditional medical evacuation procedures. The base's medical facilities had been destroyed, communication systems had been compromised, and enemy forces had made helicopter evacuation impossible, with over 200 wounded soldiers and civilians requiring immediate medical attention. The base commander had been preparing to abandon the position when Major Hartwell had stepped forward with an alternative plan. Working with limited resources and under constant enemy fire, she had transformed the base's maintenance facility into a functional field hospital, organized the civilian contractors into medical support teams, and established a ground evacuation route through hostile territory that had seemed impossible to navigate. Her improvised medical operation had saved 183 lives during a 72-hour siege that had later been studied at military academies as a masterpiece of crisis leadership. Success of that operation had led to her appointment as the youngest colonel in Army Medical Command history. Colonel Hartwell had been tasked with revolutionizing the military's approach to medical logistics, and she had exceeded every expectation. She had developed integrated medical response protocols that coordinated everything from battlefield triage to long-term rehabilitation care. Her systems had been so effective that they had been adopted not only by the U.S. military, but by allied forces around the world. Her promotion to general had come with assignment to the Pentagon, where she had been responsible for medical preparedness across all branches of the military. General Hartwell had overseen medical care for over 2.1 million active duty service members, coordinated disaster response for natural catastrophes that had affected military installations, and had been the primary architect of medical security protocols that had protected American forces from biological and chemical warfare threats. But it was her personal life that had given her work its deepest meaning. She had married Dr. Michael Chun, a military surgeon she had met during her deployment in Iraq. Their partnership had been both professional and personal. He had provided the medical expertise while she had contributed the logistical and strategic planning that had made their joint operations so successful. Together, they had saved thousands of lives and had been recognized as one of the most effective military medical teams in modern history. Their daughter Sarah had been born during General Hartwell's assignment to the Pentagon, and she had seemed destined to follow in her parents' footsteps. Brilliant, compassionate, and natural leader, Sarah had expressed interest in military medicine and had been accepted to West Point at the age of 17. She had spent her weekends volunteering at military hospitals, displaying the same instinctive ability to bring order to chaos that had defined her mother's career. The terrorist attack that had taken Sarah's life had targeted the military family housing complex at Fort Braxton, where General Hartwell had been living during her final Pentagon assignment. The attack had been precisely planned to cause maximum psychological damage to military leadership, a coordinated assault designed to demonstrate that even the families of America's most protected military personnel were vulnerable to determined enemies. Sarah had been visiting friends in the complex when the attack had occurred. General Hartwell had been in meetings at the Pentagon, coordinating medical preparedness for a major joint military exercise, when she had received the call that would shatter her world. By the time she had arrived at Fort Braxton, the attack was over, but the damage was irreversible. Sarah had been among 17 family members killed in an assault that had been designed to break the spirits of the military leadership. The investigation that had followed had revealed horrifying vulnerabilities in the security of civilian targets associated with military personnel. The attackers had exploited weaknesses in infrastructure security, communication systems, and emergency response protocols that had allowed them to cause devastating damage before any effective response could be mounted. General Hartwell had testified before Congress about these vulnerabilities, recommending comprehensive reforms that would better protect civilian targets from similar attacks, but her personal grief had been overwhelming. Dr. Chun, unable to cope with the loss of their daughter and the constant reminders of their military life, had requested transfer to a civilian hospital. Their marriage had not survived the strain of their shared grief and their different approaches to healing. While he had sought to escape reminders of their military service, she had thrown herself even deeper into her work, determined to ensure that other families would never suffer the loss that had destroyed theirs. Her final military assignment had been to develop comprehensive security protocols for civilian infrastructure that supported military operations. General Hartwell had recognized that modern warfare increasingly targeted civilian facilities, hospitals, power grids, communication networks, rather than traditional military installations. Her research had identified civilian medical facilities as particularly vulnerable targets, since attacks on hospitals could cause both immediate casualties and long-term psychological damage to communities. The deep cover mission. Riverside Medical Center had been her final service to the Riverside Medical Center had been her final service to the military before retirement. She had volunteered for the assignment specifically because it would allow her to honor Sarah's memory by protecting vulnerable civilians, particularly children, who reminded her of the daughter she had lost. The mission had required her to sacrifice her rank, her recognition, and her comfortable retirement in order to spend months working as a custodial employee. But she had accepted the assignment without hesitation. Her handler, Colonel Rebecca Nash, had been initially skeptical of assigning such a high-ranking officer to an undercover mission that could have been completed by a junior intelligence operative. But General Hartwell had insisted that the mission required someone with her level of expertise and authority, someone who could not only identify vulnerabilities, but also implement immediate solutions if a crisis occurred during the assessment. The irony had not been lost on her that she was now mopping floors in a pediatric ward, surrounded by children who faced medical challenges with the same bravery she had once observed in young soldiers. Her military career had been built on protecting people, and this mission represented the culmination of that calling, even if it required her to remain anonymous and unrecognized. What her colleagues at Riverside Medical Center could never have imagined was that their quiet night shift custodial worker had once commanded medical operations that had spanned multiple continents, had briefed presidents on medical preparedness policy, and had developed protocols that had saved more lives than any individual in modern military medical history. The woman who emptied their trash cans and mopped their floors had once been responsible for the medical welfare of over 2 million service members and had been trusted with classified information that could affect national security. The transition from commanding general to custodial worker had required not just a change in routine, but a complete psychological transformation that had tested every aspect of her military training. She had learned to suppress her instincts to take charge, to offer solutions, and to implement improvements, instead forcing herself to observe, document, and remain invisible while she completed her assessment of civilian medical security vulnerabilities. But now, as Timothy Rodriguez's life hung in the balance and the hospital security systems failed around her, General Jasmine Hartwell understood that her carefully maintained cover was about to be sacrificed for a higher purpose. The mission was about to change from intelligence gathering to active protection, and the woman who had once saved 183 lives during a 72-hour siege was preparing to save lives once again. The attack on Fort Braxton had begun at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 8 years before General Hartwell would find herself mopping floors at Riverside Medical Center. The autumn sun had been filtering through the windows of the family housing complex, where military families lived in a carefully maintained community that was supposed to represent safety, normalcy, and the rewards of military service. Children had been playing in the central courtyard, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings while their parents prepared dinner and helped with homework. Blissfully unaware that they had been under surveillance for months, Sarah Hartwell had been 17 years old. home from her first semester at West Point for a brief weekend visit. She had been staying with the Morrison family while her mother completed a critical briefing at the Pentagon regarding medical preparedness for a joint NATO exercise scheduled for the following month. General Hartwell had been in a secure conference room, reviewing casualty projections and evacuation protocols, when her secure phone had vibrated with an emergency alert that would forever divide her life into before and after. The terrorists had chosen their target with surgical precision. Fort Braxton housed the families of high-ranking military medical personnel, intelligence officers, and strategic planners, the people whose work shaped American military policy around the world. The attack had been designed not just to cause casualties, but to send a message that no one connected to the American military was beyond reach. No matter how secure their environment appeared to be, the assault had begun with a coordinated cyberattack that had disabled the base's security systems, communication networks, and emergency response protocols. Within minutes, the attackers had neutralized the electronic safeguards that protected the family housing complex, creating a window of vulnerability that they had exploited with devastating efficiency. The physical attack that had followed had been swift, coordinated, and designed to maximize psychological impact on the military leadership who would arrive to find their families under assault. General Hartwell had been explaining the logistics of battlefield medical evacuation to a room full of NATO commanders when her aide, Captain Rodriguez, had burst into the conference room with a pale face and trembling hands. "General, there's been an incident at Fort Braxton. You need to come with me immediately." The words had been spoken with careful restraint, but the look in his eyes had told her everything she needed to know before he could provide the details. The helicopter ride from the Pentagon to Fort Braxton had taken 18 minutes during which General Hartwell had maintained her professional composure while her world collapsed around her. The radio communications had been fragmentary and conflicting, but the pattern had been clear: multiple casualties, security breach, families trapped, children among the wounded. She had coordinated emergency medical response during the flight, her training taking over even as her heart shattered with each additional piece of information. When her helicopter had landed at Fort Braxton, the scene had been one of controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles had surrounded the family housing complex, their flashing lights creating a surreal atmosphere that had seemed more like a disaster movie than the reality of her daughter's life hanging in the balance. FBI agents had been establishing the perimeter while military medical teams had worked to evacuate the wounded. But the scope of the attack had overwhelmed even the most prepared response teams. General Hartwell had immediately taken command of the medical evacuation, her military instincts overriding her personal terror as she had coordinated the transport of wounded civilians to nearby hospitals. She had moved through the chaos with mechanical precision, directing resources and making tactical decisions that had saved lives, all while fighting to suppress the growing certainty that her daughter was among the casualties. The Morrison family home had been at the center of the attack zone. When General Hartwell had finally been able to reach the building, she had found Colonel Morrison and his wife being treated for injuries that were serious but not life-threatening. Their teenage son David had been wounded, but was expected to recover fully. But Sarah had been in the family's basement recreation room when the explosion had occurred, and the structural damage had been catastrophic. The rescue teams had worked for 4 hours to extract Sarah from the collapsed basement, with General Hartwell coordinating the effort while simultaneously managing the broader medical response to the attack. She had applied every lesson learned from battlefield medical operations, every protocol developed for mass casualty events, every innovation that had saved lives in combat zones around the world. But none of her expertise, none of her preparation, none of her military training had been sufficient to save the life of her own daughter. Sarah had been conscious when they had finally reached her. and the last conversation between mother and daughter had taken place in the ruins of what was supposed to have been a safe haven for military families. "Mom," Sarah had whispered through the oxygen mask that was keeping her alive, "you taught me that service means protecting people who can't protect themselves. Promise me you'll keep doing that." General Hartwell had held her daughter's hand and made that promise, not knowing that it would become the defining commitment of the rest of her life. The investigation that had followed Sarah's death had revealed security vulnerabilities that had kept General Hartwell awake for months afterward. The attackers had exploited weaknesses in civilian infrastructure that supported military operations, power grids, communication networks, and emergency response systems that had been designed for peacetime operations rather than coordinated terrorist attacks. The family housing complex had been protected by security measures that were adequate for traditional threats, but completely inadequate for the sophisticated multi-vector assault that had been launched against it. More devastating than the security failures had been the discovery that the attack had been planned for over 2 years, with the terrorists conducting detailed surveillance of military families and their daily routines. They had known which children attended which schools, which families had medical vulnerabilities, and which targets would cause the maximum psychological damage to key military personnel. Sarah had not been a random victim. She had been specifically targeted because of her mother's role in military medical operations. General Hartwell's marriage to Dr. Michael Chun had become a casualty of their shared grief and their different approaches to processing the loss of their daughter. He had blamed the military lifestyle for making their family a target, while she had blamed herself for failing to anticipate and prevent the attack. Their relationship had deteriorated over months of painful conversations about whether their service had been worth the price they had paid, whether the military could have done more to protect their family, and whether they could continue to work in an environment that constantly reminded them of what they had lost. The divorce had been finalized 18 months after Sarah's death, with both parents agreeing that they needed to pursue separate paths toward healing. Dr. Chun had transferred to a civilian hospital and had eventually remarried, building a new life that had no connection to the military service that had cost him his daughter. General Hartwell had made the opposite choice, throwing herself deeper into her military service while struggling with survivor's guilt that had threatened to overwhelm her professional capabilities. Her final years of active duty had been shaped by an obsessive focus on protecting civilian targets that could be vulnerable to terrorist attacks. She had testified before Congress about security vulnerabilities, had developed new protocols for protecting military families, and had worked with intelligence agencies to identify and neutralize threats before they could be executed. But she had also been haunted by the knowledge that all of her expertise had been insufficient to protect the person who had mattered most to her. The decision to accept the deep cover mission at Riverside Medical Center had been motivated by her promise to Sarah and her recognition that civilian medical facilities represented exactly the kind of vulnerable target that had been exploited in the attack on Fort Braxton. She had understood that hospitals were soft targets with life or death responsibilities, making them attractive to terrorists who wanted to cause maximum damage with minimum resources. But the mission had also been a form of penance, a way for General Hartwell to honor her daughter's memory by protecting other people's children in an environment where her military rank and recognition would be invisible. She had needed to prove to herself that her service had value beyond the uniforms and medals, that her expertise could protect vulnerable people even when she received no credit or recognition for her efforts. Working in the pediatric ward had been both healing and heartbreaking, as she had been surrounded by children who faced medical challenges with the same courage that Sarah had displayed during her final moments. Every child she had encountered during her custodial rounds had reminded her of her daughter's bravery, and she had found a measure of peace in the knowledge that her presence at the hospital was contributing to their safety and recovery. The irony had been profound. The woman, who had once commanded medical operations for over 2 million service members, was now emptying trash cans and mopping floors. But she had found more purpose in this anonymous service than she had experienced during her final years as a decorated general. The mission had allowed her to process her grief while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that her expertise might be needed to protect innocent lives from the kind of coordinated attack that had taken her daughter. Now, as the cyberattack unfolded around her and Timothy Rodriguez's life hung in the balance, General Hartwell understood that her moment of reckoning had arrived. The skills that had failed to save Sarah would be tested again, and the promise she had made to her dying daughter would finally be fulfilled in the sterile corridors of Riverside Medical Center. The cyberattack had not been random. As General Hartwell set down her mop bucket and prepared to reveal her true identity, her trained mind was already analyzing the attack patterns that civilian staff couldn't recognize. The systematic targeting of medical infrastructure, the precise timing of backup system failures, and the coordinated nature of the assault across multiple hospital networks all pointed to a state-sponsored operation that she had been tracking through intelligence channels for the past 18 months. What the hospital staff didn't know was that Riverside Medical Center had been specifically chosen as a target because of its strategic importance to the region's emergency medical response network. The facility served as the primary trauma center for a metropolitan area of over 800,000 people, and its pediatric intensive care unit was the only facility within a 200-mile radius capable of treating children with complex medical conditions like Timothy Rodriguez's rare autoimmune disorder. The attackers had done their homework with the same meticulous planning that had characterized the assault on Fort Braxton 8 years earlier. They had identified the hospital's most vulnerable patients, mapped the facility's backup systems, and designed their cyberattack to create maximum chaos during the night shift when staffing levels were at their lowest and response capabilities were most limited. This wasn't just terrorism, it was psychological warfare designed to demonstrate that no civilian facility, no matter how essential to public health, was beyond their reach. General Hartwell had recognized the attack signature within the first 10 minutes of the system failures. The pattern matched intelligence reports about a cyber-criminal organization known as the Veil that had been linked to attacks on civilian infrastructure in Eastern Europe. But this operation showed a level of sophistication that suggested state backing and access to classified information about American medical facilities. Someone had provided these attackers with detailed intelligence about Riverside Medical Center's vulnerabilities, and that someone had intimate knowledge of American medical infrastructure security protocols. As she moved toward the central nurses' station, her 6 months of careful observation crystallized into a tactical assessment that would have impressed any Pentagon briefing room. She knew exactly which backup systems were operational, which communication channels remained secure, and which staff members had the technical expertise necessary to implement emergency protocols that had never been tested outside of military medical facilities. Dr. Montgomery's shocked reaction to her identity revelation was understandable but irrelevant. General Hartwell had spent her entire military career making life-or-death decisions under pressure, and she had learned that in crisis situations, establishing authority was less important than achieving results. The medical staff could process her identity later. Right now, Timothy Rodriguez had less than 15 minutes before his condition would deteriorate beyond the point of medical intervention. Dr. Montgomery, she continued, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect in Pentagon briefing rooms. This attack is targeting civilian medical facilities, specifically because hospitals, like this one, represent critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. The attackers have studied your systems for months, and they know exactly how to create maximum chaos with minimum resources. I've been conducting a classified assessment of civilian medical security for the past 6 months, and I know how to counter their strategy. Nurse Caldwell, who had been frozen in shock since her identity revelation, suddenly found his voice. But you've been cleaning floors. How do you know about emergency protocols that I've never even heard of? His question reflected the cognitive dissonance that everyone in the corridor was experiencing, the inability to reconcile the quiet custodial worker they had known with the commanding military officer who had suddenly appeared before them. General Hartwell pulled the encrypted communication device from her custodial cart, revealing equipment that looked distinctly military and completely out of place among cleaning supplies. Nurse Caldwell, the emergency protocol I referenced is from military medical field operations. It's designed for situations where traditional medical infrastructure has been compromised, and medical personnel need to operate with limited resources and no computer support. I've used these protocols to save lives in combat zones, and they'll work here. Security Chief Delacroix had been attempting to establish communication with hospital administration and external emergency services, but his efforts had been frustrated by the systematic disruption of communication networks that was characteristic of coordinated cyberattacks. When General Hartwell instructed him to contact Fort Braxton Medical Command, he had initially assumed she was suffering from some form of psychological break brought on by the crisis. But something in her tone, her posture, and her obvious familiarity with military terminology made him hesitate before dismissing her instructions. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Why would I contact a military medical facility? This is a civilian hospital emergency, and I don't have authorization to." His objection was interrupted by the increasingly urgent alarms from Timothy's medical equipment, which indicated that the child's condition was deteriorating rapidly despite the medical staff's best efforts to stabilize him. Manually, General Hartwell activated her encrypted communication device with movements that spoke of years of practice with military equipment. Chief Delacroix, Fort Braxton Medical Command maintains secure communication channels that are hardened against cyberattacks. They can establish a direct link to pharmaceutical databases and medical protocol systems that these attackers haven't been able to compromise. More importantly, they can coordinate with federal emergency response teams that have experience dealing with coordinated infrastructure attacks. The device crackled to life, and suddenly the corridor was filled with the distinctive sound of military communications, precise, professional, and completely incongruous with the civilian hospital environment. Fort Braxton Medical Command. This is General Hartwell requesting immediate emergency assistance for civilian medical facility under coordinated cyberattack. Authentication code Zulu 77 Alpha 9. I need direct access to secure pharmaceutical databases and emergency medical protocols. The response was immediate and carried the tone of profound shock mixed with military discipline. General Hartwell, this is Colonel Nash. Ma'am, we've been monitoring the coordinated attacks on civilian medical infrastructure. Your facility is one of 7 hospitals in the region that have been targeted simultaneously. We've been attempting to establish communication with civilian authorities, but most emergency response networks have been compromised. What is your current status and immediate needs? Dr. Montgomery, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, finally found her voice. This is impossible. You've been working here for 6 months. We've had conversations about your family, your background. None of this makes sense. Her medical training had taught her to trust evidence and logical reason. Working in the pediatric ward had been both healing and heartbreaking, as she had been surrounded by children who faced medical challenges with the same courage that Sarah had displayed during her final moments. Every child she had encountered during her custodial rounds had reminded her of her daughter's bravery, and she had found a measure of peace in the knowledge that her presence at the hospital was contributing to their safety and recovery. The irony had been profound. The woman who had once commanded medical operations for over 2 million servants. Dr. Montgomery, I know this is difficult to process, but I need you to trust me for the next 20 minutes. I've spent 6 months studying this hospital's vulnerabilities as part of a classified assessment of civilian medical infrastructure. This attack was planned specifically to exploit the weaknesses I've been documenting, and I know how to work around their strategy. But I need your medical expertise combined with military emergency protocols that can function without computer support. She turned back to her communication device, where Colonel Nash was coordinating with multiple agencies to address the coordinated attack on civilian medical facilities. Colonel, I need immediate access to pediatric immunosuppressant protocols for rare autoimmune disorders. Patient is an 8-year-old male with a condition that requires precise medication timing, and the civilian systems are completely compromised. Can you patch me through to military pediatric specialists who can provide manual dosage calculations? The response came with the efficiency that characterized military medical operations. General, we're establishing a secure link to Walter Reed pediatric specialists right now. Dr. Amanda Foster is standing by with manual protocols for rare childhood autoimmune disorders. Additionally, we're coordinating with FBI cybersecurity teams to begin restoration of civilian medical networks. But that process will take several hours. Rosa Rodriguez, Timothy's mother, had been listening to this exchange with growing hope mixed with confusion. She didn't understand the technical details of what was happening, but she could hear the confidence in General Hartwell's voice and the immediate response from military medical personnel who were clearly taking her seriously. For the first time since the crisis had begun, someone seemed to have a plan that went beyond hoping the computer systems would somehow restart themselves. The transformation in the hospital corridor was palpable. What had been a scene of growing desperation and helpless frustration was suddenly becoming an organized emergency response operation directed by someone with the authority and expertise to cut through bureaucratic obstacles and implement solutions that transcended normal hospital protocols. The quiet custodial worker had disappeared entirely, replaced by a military commander who was treating this crisis as a tactical operation that required coordination between civilian medical expertise and military emergency response capabilities. But General Hartwell knew that revealing her identity was only the first step in a complex operation that would test every lesson she had learned during her military career. The attackers had planned this assault carefully, and they would undoubtedly have contingency plans for dealing with unexpected resistance to their strategy. The real test was about to begin, and the life of Timothy Rodriguez would depend on whether her military training could compensate for the sophisticated cyberattack that was designed to cripple civilian medical infrastructure. The mission had just shifted from intelligence gathering to active combat, and General Jasmine Hartwell was prepared to fight for every life in her new area of operations. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. General Hartwell's hands moved across the hospital's backup systems with the precision of a concert pianist, activating emergency protocols that most civilian medical personnel didn't even know existed. Her fingers flew over manual override switches that had been designed for extreme circumstances but had never been used in the hospital's 15-year operational history. The muscle memory of 28 years of military service took control, and the quiet custodial worker vanished completely. Dr. Montgomery, I need you to manually access Medication Vault 7 using the mechanical key override, she commanded while simultaneously coordinating with Fort Braxton Medical Command through her encrypted device. The vault is located behind the false panel next to the main pharmacy station. The mechanical lock combination is hospital establishment date plus current year. That's 2008 to 2024. These systems were designed to function during power failures, but civilian staff are rarely trained on their operation. Dr. Montgomery stared at her in amazement. How do you know about mechanical overrides that I've never heard of in 15 years of working here? But even as she spoke, she was moving toward the pharmacy station, her medical training overriding her confusion because Timothy's condition was deteriorating rapidly on the monitors. General Hartwell was already 3 steps ahead, her tactical mind processing multiple emergency protocols simultaneously. Nurse Caldwell, I need you to establish manual life support for Timothy using the emergency hand crank. Ventilator stored in supply closet C7, it's military surplus. Equipment that was donated to this hospital, but never cataloged in your computer systems. The device doesn't require electrical power and can maintain patient breathing indefinitely with proper operation. Her knowledge of the hospital's hidden resources was encyclopedic and impossible to explain through 6 months of custodial work alone. She directed staff to emergency medical supplies that had been donated by military medical units, but had never been integrated into the hospital's standard inventory systems. She knew the location of backup communication equipment that had been installed during the hospital's construction, but had been forgotten by successive administrative changes. Most remarkably, she understood the hospital's physical infrastructure with the thoroughness of someone who had studied detailed architectural plans rather than simply mopping floors. Chief Delacroix, access the emergency communication array in basement storage room B12, she continued, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to coordinating complex operations under extreme pressure. The equipment is hardened against electromagnetic interference and can establish direct communication with federal emergency response teams. The activation sequence is printed on a laminated card attached to the primary radio unit, while civilian staff scrambled to follow her instructions. General Hartwell established communication protocols that demonstrated her intimate familiarity with federal emergency response networks. She coordinated with agencies that most hospital administrators had never heard of, using communication channels that required security clearances and authentication codes that she recited from memory. Her conversations with Military Medical Command were conducted in precise technical language that revealed her deep understanding of both military medical protocols and civilian hospital operations. Fort Braxton Medical Command. This is General Hartwell requesting immediate consultation with Dr. Amanda Foster regarding pediatric immunosuppressant protocols for Timothy Rodriguez, age 8, presenting with rare autoimmune disorder complicated by stress-induced cardiac irregularities. She spoken to her encrypted device while simultaneously monitoring the manual medical equipment that hospital staff were connecting to Timothy's bedside. Patient requires immediate medication. Intervention using manual dosage calculations based on current vital signs and medical history. The response from Dr. Foster came through crystal clear on the secure military communication channel. General Hartwell, I have the patient's medical records accessed through our secure database backup. Based on his condition and current vital signs, I'm recommending a modified immunosuppressant cocktail that can be manually prepared using standard hospital pharmacy supplies. I'm transmitting the precise dosage calculations and preparation instructions now. What amazed the civilian medical staff was not just General Hartwell's knowledge of emergency protocols, but her ability to seamlessly integrate military medical resources with civilian hospital operations. She translated Dr. Foster's military medical terminology into language that Dr. Montgomery could immediately understand and implement, while simultaneously coordinating with multiple federal agencies to address The broader cyberattack that was affecting hospitals throughout the region. Dr. Montgomery, who had successfully accessed the mechanical medication vault using General Hartwell's instructions, was now preparing Timothy's medication with manual calculations provided by military medical specialists. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with professional admiration. "These protocols are more sophisticated than anything we use in civilian medicine. How long have you been planning for this kind of emergency?" General Hartwell was coordinating the manual operation of Timothy's life support equipment while maintaining communication with federal cybersecurity teams who were working to restore the hospital's computer networks. Dr. Montgomery, these protocols were developed for battlefield medical operations where computer systems are routinely compromised by enemy action. I've adapted them for civilian medical facilities based on 6 months of detailed assessment of your infrastructure vulnerabilities. Her expertise extended far beyond medical protocols. She demonstrated an intimate understanding of hospital security systems, directing Chief Delacroix to activate backup security measures that would protect the facility from potential physical assault while the cyberattack continued. She knew the location of emergency lockdown procedures that could isolate critical areas of the hospital, and she understood the communication protocols necessary to coordinate with law enforcement agencies that were responding to similar attacks throughout the region. Chief Delacroix, activate security protocol Delta 7 using the manual controls located in your office safe, she instructed while monitoring Timothy's improving vital signs on the manual medical equipment. The combination is your hire date plus your badge number. This will isolate the hospital's critical areas and establish secure perimeters that can't be compromised by electronic interference. Nurse Caldwell, who was operating the manual ventilator with instructions provided by General Hartwell, was amazed by the sophistication of the military medical equipment that had been hidden in the hospital's storage areas. "General, this equipment is more advanced than our computerized systems. Why wasn't this integrated into our standard medical protocols?" The answer revealed the depth of General Hartwell's mission and the scope of her expertise. Nurse Caldwell, this equipment represents military medical technology that's typically classified, but has been selectively distributed to civilian medical facilities as part of emergency preparedness initiatives. Most hospital administrators don't know about this equipment because it's intended for use only during catastrophic infrastructure failures like coordinated cyberattacks. As Timothy's condition stabilized under the combination of military medical protocols and civilian medical expertise, the broader scope of General Hartwell's capabilities became apparent to everyone in the corridor. She was simultaneously coordinating medical treatment for a critically ill child, managing hospital security during a cyberattack, and directing federal emergency response operations that involved multiple agencies and military commands. Her communication with federal agencies revealed that the attack on Riverside Medical Center was part of a coordinated assault on civilian infrastructure that included hospitals, power grids, and communication networks across 7 states. The attackers had demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggested state sponsorship and access to classified information about American infrastructure vulnerabilities. Colonel Nash, this attack pattern matches the intelligence assessments we discussed regarding coordinated infrastructure warfare, she reported to Fort Braxton Medical Command. The timing, targeting, and technical sophistication all indicate that this is a test run for larger-scale operations. I recommend immediate coordination with NSA, cybersecurity teams, and activation of federal emergency response protocols for critical infrastructure protection. Dr. Montgomery, who was now successfully administering Timothy's medication using military medical protocols, watched in amazement as General Hartwell coordinated operations that extended far beyond their hospital. "General, you're not just treating our emergency, your coordinating response to a national security incident. How long have you been preparing for this? The answer would have stunned anyone who had known Jazz, the custodial worker. General Hartwell had been tracking the development of coordinated infrastructure attacks for over 2 years, working with intelligence agencies to identify potential vulnerabilities and develop response protocols that could protect civilian targets from sophisticated assault. Her mission at Riverside Medical Center had been designed to test these protocols under real-world conditions, but she had never expected to implement them during an actual attack. Timothy Rodriguez's vital signs were now stabilizing on the manual medical equipment, and his medication was beginning to address the autoimmune crisis that had threatened his life. But General Hartwell knew that saving one child was only the beginning of a much larger operation that would test every aspect of her military training and her commitment to protecting civilian infrastructure from enemies who understood that modern warfare was as much about destroying civilian morale as about defeating military forces. The quiet custodial worker who had mopped floors for 6 months had revealed herself to be one of the most qualified emergency response coordinators in the country, and the real test of her capabilities was just beginning. Secure communication channel crackled within urgency that penetrated every corner of the pediatric ward as word of General Hartwell's identity spread through military command structures with lightning speed. Within 20 minutes of her initial contact with Fort Braxton Medical Command, her encrypted device was receiving incoming calls from the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI's Cybercrime Division. The quiet custodial worker who had been invisible for 6 months had suddenly become the focal point of a national security operation. General Hartwell. "This is Admiral Patricia Sinclair, Joint Chiefs Medical Operations," came the voice through her device, carrying the weight of military authority that everyone in the hospital corridor could hear clearly. "Ma'am, we've been monitoring the coordinated infrastructure attacks, and your facility appears to be ground zero for the most sophisticated assault we've seen to date. We need your immediate assessment of enemy capabilities and recommended response protocols." The hospital staff watched in stunned silence as their former custodial worker responded to one of the highest-ranking military medical officers in the country with the casual professionalism of someone accustomed to such conversations. "Admiral Sinclair, the attack demonstrates advanced persistent threat capabilities with state-level resources. The attackers have detailed intelligence about civilian medical infrastructure that suggests either insider information or extensive reconnaissance operations. I recommend immediate activation of federal emergency medical protocols and coordination with NS's cyber warfare units." Dr. Montgomery, who was monitoring Timothy's steadily improving condition, found herself witnessing a conversation that seemed more appropriate for a Pentagon briefing room than a hospital corridor. The technical language, the references to classified operations, and the obvious respect that high-ranking military officers were showing to their former cleaning lady created a cognitive dissonance that challenged everything she thought she understood about the world around her. Nurse Caldwell, who had been operating the manual ventilator under General Hartwell's expert guidance, whispered to Dr. Montgomery, "This is impossible. I've been working with her for 6 months. We've talked about her family, her struggles with English, her concerns about paying rent. How is she suddenly coordinating with the Pentagon?" His question reflected the confusion that everyone was experiencing as they tried to reconcile the humble woman they had known with the military commander who was now directing federal emergency response operations. The recognition cascaded through multiple channels simultaneously. FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb, who had been coordinating the federal response to the coordinated cyberattacks, called the hospital directly after being briefed on General Hartwell's identity. "General, This is Special Agent Webb, FBI Cybercrime Division. Ma'am, we've been tracking the organization responsible for these attacks for over 18 months. Your expertise in military medical logistics combined with your first-hand experience of their tactics makes you the most qualified person in the country to help us understand their operational strategy. Security Chief Delacroix, who had initially been skeptical of taking orders from a custodial worker, was now coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies that were treating General Hartwell as their primary consultant on the crisis. General, FBI is requesting permission to establish a command post here at the hospital. They want to use your knowledge of the facility's infrastructure to understand how the attackers gained such detailed information about our vulnerabilities. The media discovery was inevitable and immediate. Rachel Martinez, an investigative journalist who had been covering the coordinated cyberattacks for Channel 7 News, had been monitoring federal emergency communication channels when she heard references to General Hartwell directing operations from Riverside Medical Center. A quick search of military records had revealed the identity of the decorated general who had supposedly retired 2 years earlier, and the story had exploded across social media within minutes. "Dr. Montgomery, you need to see this," said Linda Torres, the custodial supervisor who had arrived at the hospital after hearing about the emergency. She was holding her smartphone, which displayed a news headline that made everyone in the corridor stop and stare. Decorated General discovered working as hospital janitor while directing federal response to cyberattack. The article included military photos of General Hartwell in full dress uniform, receiving medals from senior military leaders, and briefing members of Congress on medical preparedness policy. The contrast between the military photographs and the quiet woman they had known as Jazz was so stark that several staff members initially refused to believe the news reports. But the evidence was undeniable. The woman in the military photographs was unmistakably the same person who had been mopping their floors, emptying their trash cans, and quietly observing their operations for 6 months. Hospital Administrator David Richardson, who had been in emergency meetings with board members about the cyberattack, arrived at the pediatric ward to find his facility had become the center of a national news story. "General Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and professional concern, "I need to understand what's happening here. Are you telling me that one of our custodial workers is actually a retired general who's been conducting some kind of undercover operation in my hospital?" General Hartwell, who was simultaneously monitoring Timothy's medical progress and coordinating with multiple federal agencies, turned to face the hospital administrator with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining complex operations to civilian leadership. "Mr. Richardson, I've been conducting a classified assessment of civilian medical infrastructure vulnerabilities under the authority of the Department of Defense. My mission was to identify security weaknesses that could be exploited by hostile forces targeting civilian medical facilities. Tonight's attack validates every concern that led to this assessment." The recognition from her former military colleagues was overwhelming and deeply personal. Colonel Rebecca Nash, who had been her handler throughout the Undercover mission, arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of the initial crisis. When she walked into the pediatric ward and saw General Hartwell coordinating emergency operations while wearing her custodial uniform, the emotion in her voice was evident to everyone present. "Jasmine," she said, using General Hartwell's first name with the familiarity of someone who had served alongside her for years, "when you volunteered for this mission, I never imagined you'd end up saving lives during an actual attack. The Pentagon is calling this the most successful integration of military medical protocols with civilian emergency response in modern history." The validation from civilian medical professionals was equally significant. Dr. Amanda Foster, the military pediatric specialist who had provided the protocols that saved Timothy's life, arrived at the hospital as part of a federal medical response team. When she met General Hartwell in person, her professional admiration was evident to everyone present. "General, your adaptation of military medical protocols for civilian hospital operations represents a breakthrough in emergency medical preparedness," Dr. Foster said while examining Timothy, whose condition had stabilized completely under the military medical protocols. The integration of military emergency resources with civilian medical expertise has created a response capability that neither sector could achieve independently. The most powerful recognition came from Timothy Rodriguez's parents, who had watched their son's life saved by protocols and equipment that they never knew existed. Rosa Rodriguez, Timothy's mother, approached General Hartwell with tears in her eyes and a gratitude that transcended any military commendation. "General, I don't understand military ranks or government operations," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "But I understand that you saved my son's life when no one else knew how to help him. For 6 months, you've been taking care of this hospital, and tonight you took care of my baby. Thank you." The simple acknowledgement from a grateful mother carried more weight than any official recognition from military leadership. The social media response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The story of the decorated general who had been working as a custodial worker while secretly protecting civilian medical infrastructure captured public imagination in a way that traditional military heroism rarely achieved. The hashtag General Janitor began trending within hours, with thousands of people sharing stories about essential workers whose true contributions were often invisible and undervalued. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who had served under General Hartwell during her Pentagon assignment, posted a message on social media that was shared thousands of times. "I served under General Hartwell for 3 years. She taught us that true leadership means serving wherever you're needed, regardless of recognition or rank. Tonight, she proved that lesson again by saving lives while the world thought she was just mopping floors." The recognition extended beyond military circles to civilian emergency preparedness experts who understood the significance of what had been accomplished. Dr. Michael Santos, a national expert on hospital security, was interviewed on national television about the incident. "What General Hartwell accomplished tonight represents a revolution in how we think about civilian infrastructure protection," he explained to millions of viewers. "She demonstrated that military medical expertise can be seamlessly integrated with civilian hospital operations to create response capabilities that can counter even the most sophisticated attacks on our medical infrastructure." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the children in the pediatric ward, who had always known Jazz as the gentle cleaning lady who hummed softly while she worked, and always had an encouraging word for young patients facing difficult medical challenges. When 8-year-old Maria Santos, who had been a patient in the ward for several weeks, learned that Jazz was actually a general, she created a hand-drawn card that read, "Thank you, General Jazz, for keeping us safe and for always being nice to kids." The transformation was complete. The invisible custodial worker had become a national symbol of hidden heroism and selfless service. But the recognition carried with it the weight of expectations and responsibilities that would forever change her carefully constructed quiet life. Aftermath of the revelation brought a cascade of consequences that transformed not only General Hartwell's life, but the entire landscape of civilian medical infrastructure security. Within 48 hours of the attack, she found herself at the center of a national conversation about hidden vulnerabilities in systems that millions of Americans depended on for their lives. The Pentagon immediately established a task force to study her integration of military medical protocols with civilian hospital operations, while Congress announced hearings on medical infrastructure security that would feature her as the primary witness. The personal reckoning came first in a quiet conversation with Dr. Montgomery in Timothy Rodriguez's hospital room, where the boy was recovering fully under continued monitoring. The doctor sat beside General Hartwell in the early morning hours after the crisis had passed. Both women exhausted but unable to sleep after the intensity of the previous night's events. "I keep thinking about all the conversations we had," Dr. Montgomery said, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and something that might have been hurt. "You asked me about my family, my medical training, my hopes for the hospital's future. Were any of those conversations real, or was I just part of your mission?" The question reflected the complex emotions that many hospital staff members were experiencing as they processed the discovery that someone they had trusted and cared about had been living an elaborate fiction. General Hartwell looked at Timothy, whose peaceful sleep represented the successful culmination of everything she had worked toward during her months of careful preparation. "Dr. Montgomery, every conversation we had was real. The mission gave me a reason to be here, but the relationships I formed, the respect I developed for your medical expertise, and the genuine care I came to feel for the patients and staff, none of that was part of any operation. I asked about your family because I genuinely wanted to know about your life, not because I needed intelligence." The conversation represented a turning point in how General Hartwell understood her own experience during the Undercover mission. She had begun the assignment focused on gathering intelligence about security vulnerabilities, but she had discovered something more profound about the nature of service and the ways that different forms of dedication could honor the same fundamental values. Her work as a custodial employee had been as meaningful as her service as a general, and the relationship she had formed while mopping floors had been as genuine as any she had experienced during her military career. The hospital administration faced its own complex reconciliation with the discovery that they had been unknowingly hosting a classified federal operation. Hospital Administrator David Richardson found himself navigating between gratitude for General Hartwell's life-saving intervention and concern about the legal and ethical implications of having had a federal agent operating undercover in his facility without his knowledge or consent. "General, I understand that your mission was authorized at the highest levels of government," Richardson said during a meeting that included federal representatives and hospital board members. "But I need to understand what other classified operations might be taking place in civilian facilities without our knowledge. How do we balance national security needs with our obligation to maintain transparency with our patients and staff?" The question highlighted broader issues about the intersection of national security operations with civilian institutions, but General Hartwell's response reflected her deep respect for civilian autonomy and democratic principles. "Mr. Richardson, my mission was specifically designed to assess vulnerabilities and develop protective protocols, not to conduct ongoing surveillance or operations within civilian facilities. The goal was to strengthen civilian medical infrastructure, not to compromise civilian institutional independence." Her integration of her military identity with her newfound appreciation for civilian medical service took shape through a series of decisions that surprised both military leadership and civilian hospital administration. Rather than returning to a traditional military consulting role, General Hartwell proposed something unprecedented: a permanent liaison position that would allow her to continue working at Riverside Medical Center, while also serving as a consultant to federal agencies on civilian medical infrastructure security. Proposal faced initial resistance from both military and civilian administrators who were uncertain about how to manage such an unusual arrangement. General Hartwell's response was to demonstrate the practical benefits of her unique position through a comprehensive security assessment that identified vulnerabilities and solutions that neither purely military nor purely civilian perspectives could have achieved independently. "Colonel Nash," she explained to her military handler, during a secure conference call that included Pentagon leadership, "my 6 months of ground-level experience in civilian medical operations has given me insights that can't be replicated through traditional military assessment methods. I understand both the capabilities and limitations of civilian medical staff in ways that will be essential for developing realistic emergency response protocols." The civilian medical community's recognition of her contributions extended far beyond Riverside Medical Center. Dr. Amanda Foster, the military pediatric specialist who had coordinated Timothy's treatment, worked with General Hartwell to develop training programs that would teach civilian medical staff how to implement military emergency protocols during infrastructure failures. The collaboration resulted in certification programs that were quickly adopted by hospitals throughout the region. Her relationship with the custodial staff representative, particularly meaningful aspect of her reconciliation with her dual identity. Maria Santos, her former day shift counterpart, initially felt betrayed by the discovery that her friend Jazz had been living a fiction for 6 months. But their conversation in the hospital break room revealed the genuine mutual respect that had developed between them, despite the deception about General Hartwell's background. General, I don't understand why someone with your education and position would choose to clean floors with me," Maria said, her voice carrying years of experience with being overlooked and undervalued in service positions. "Was it just part of your mission, or did you actually learn something from working alongside us?" General Hartwell's response reflected a profound personal transformation that had occurred during her months of anonymous service. "Maria, working alongside you taught me more about dedication, dignity, and service than 28 years of military training. You show up every day, you take pride in your work, and you care for people without expecting recognition or advancement. That's a form of heroism that I never fully understood until I experienced it myself." The recognition from federal agencies culminated in a ceremony at the Pentagon where General Hartwell was presented with the Distinguished Service Medal for her contributions to civilian infrastructure security. But she had insisted that the ceremony include recognition for the civilian medical staff who had implemented military protocols during the crisis, ensuring that Dr. Montgomery, Nurse Caldwell, and other hospital personnel were honored alongside her military achievement. Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams, who presented the medal, acknowledged the unprecedented nature of General Hartwell's service. "General Hartwell has demonstrated that military expertise can be integrated with civilian operations in ways that strengthen both sectors without compromising the independence and integrity of civilian institutions. Her service represents a new model for how military and civilian sectors can collaborate to protect American communities." The personal healing that had begun during her months of anonymous service was completed through her decision to establish a foundation in her daughter Sarah's memory that would provide security assessments and emergency preparedness training for civilian medical facilities serving vulnerable populations. The foundation would allow her to continue honoring her promise to Sarah while building on the relationships and expertise she had developed during her undercover mission. Her final reconciliation was with the memory of her daughter and the guilt that had driven her to seek anonymous service as a form of penance. Standing in Timothy Rodriguez's hospital room as he prepared for discharge, surrounded by his grateful family and the medical staff who had become her genuine friends and colleagues, General Hartwell finally understood that Sarah's legacy was not defined by the circumstances of her death, but by the lives that could be saved through the application of the values she had embodied. Sarah always said that service means protecting people who Can't protect themselves, she whispered to Colonel Nash as they watched Timothy's family celebrate his recovery. I thought I had failed her, but I realize now that every life we save honors her memory in ways that no amount of guilt or self-punishment ever could. The transformation was complete. The broken general who had hidden behind a custodial worker's anonymity had become a whole person who could integrate military expertise with civilian service, professional achievement with personal healing, and individual grief with collective protection. The mission had ended, but the person who had emerged from it was prepared for a new kind of service that honored both her military training and her newfound understanding of civilian heroism. 3 years after the night that changed everything, General Jasmine Hartwell stood before a packed auditorium at the National Medical Security Institute, an organization she had founded to bridge the gap between military emergency protocols and civilian medical preparedness. The audience consisted of hospital administrators, federal emergency coordinators, military medical specialists, and civilian healthcare workers from across the country, all gathered to learn from the woman who had revolutionized how America thought about protecting its most vulnerable infrastructure. The Institute occupied a gleaming new facility just outside Washington, D.C., but General Hartwell had insisted that the main training center replicate the environment of a working hospital, complete with patient rooms, emergency equipment, and even custodial stations where participants could learn that every role in a medical facility contributed to overall security and patient care. The message was intentional and personal. True preparedness required understanding and respecting every level of service, from the most senior physicians to the custodial staff who moved unseen through every corner of medical facilities. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once saved Timothy Rodriguez's life, but now served to educate thousands of medical professionals annually. Emergency preparedness is not about having the most sophisticated computer systems or the most expensive backup equipment. It's about having people who understand their roles, trust their colleagues, and can adapt their expertise when normal protocols fail. The transformation in her life had been profound but organic. The Sarah Hartwell Foundation for Medical Infrastructure Security had become the nation's leading authority on civilian medical emergency preparedness, but it operated with a philosophy that honored both military precision and civilian compassion. Every training program included modules on recognizing the human impact of infrastructure failures, ensuring that technical solutions were always balanced with concern for patient welfare and family emotional needs. Timothy Rodriguez, now 11 years old and completely healthy, served as a living reminder of why the work mattered. He attended the Institute's annual graduation ceremony each year, not as a poster child for medical heroism, but as a representative of the thousands of patients whose lives depended on the preparedness and dedication of medical professionals. His presence reminded everyone that behind every emergency protocol and security measure were real people with families who loved them. Timothy, General Hartwell said during this year's ceremony, "Would you like to tell our graduates what you remember about the night we met?" The boy, now confident and articulate, stepped to the podium with the poise of someone who had grown up understanding that his survival had contributed to something larger than himself. "I remember being scared because the machines weren't working," Timothy said, his voice clear and strong. "But I also remember that everyone in the hospital worked together to take care of me, even when they didn't have their computers." General Hartwell taught me that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they just know how to help when things go wrong. The audience, which included Dr. Montgomery and Nurse Caldwell among this year's distinguished graduates, understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American medical education. The integration of military emergency protocols with civilian medical training had created a new generation of healthcare professionals who could maintain patient care under the most challenging circumstances, but who also understood that technical competence meant nothing without genuine compassion for the people they served. Dr. Montgomery, who had been promoted to Chief of Pediatric Emergency Medicine at Riverside Medical Center, had become one of the Institute's most effective instructors, teaching civilian medical professionals how to implement military medical protocols while maintaining the patient-centered approach that defined excellent civilian healthcare. Her partnership with General Hartwell had resulted in emergency response protocols that were now used in hospitals throughout North America and Europe. The most important lesson I learned, Dr. Montgomery told new trainees during her orientation session, is that preparedness is not about anticipating every possible emergency, but about developing the skills and relationships that allow you to adapt to any crisis. General Hartwell didn't save Timothy's life because she had predicted that specific emergency, but because she had spent months learning to work with our medical team and understanding our capabilities. The Institute's impact extended far beyond medical facilities. Federal agencies now consulted with General Hartwell's organization when developing security protocols for critical civilian infrastructure, recognizing that her unique combination of military expertise and civilian operational experience provided insights that traditional security assessments could not achieve. The model she had developed at Riverside Medical Center had been adapted for schools, transportation systems, and public utilities, creating a comprehensive approach to civilian infrastructure protection that emphasized resilience and adaptability over purely defensive measures. Maria Santos, the custodial worker who had befriended General Hartwell during her undercover mission, had accepted a position as the Institute's Director of Operational Excellence, a role that recognized the critical importance of support staff in maintaining facility security and emergency preparedness. Her background in custodial work, combined with training in emergency management, had made her one of the country's leading experts on how infrastructure vulnerabilities could be identified and addressed by personnel who had access to every corner of critical facilities. People think that security is about cameras and locks, Maria explained to a group of federal emergency coordinators during a training session. But real security comes from having people who care about their work and notice when things aren't right. General Hartwell understood that custodial staff see things that administrators and security personnel miss, and she taught us how to use that knowledge to protect the people we serve. The personal transformation in General Hartwell's life had been as significant as her professional achievements. She had remarried Dr. Michael Chun, her former husband, after both of them had found healing through their shared commitment to honoring Sarah's memory through service to others. Their relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of mutual understanding about how grief could be transformed into purpose, and how individual loss could contribute to collective protection and healing. Their home, located near the Institute, had become a gathering place for the extended community of medical professionals, emergency coordinators, and federal agents who had been touched by General Hartwell's work. The dinner table conversations often centered on new challenges in medical infrastructure security, but they were balanced by discussions of family life, community involvement, and the ordinary joys that made extraordinary service meaningful and sustainable. The legacy that General Hartwell had created extended beyond any individual achievement or recognition. The principles she had demonstrated during her months as a custodial worker, that genuine service required humility, that effectiveness required understanding every level of an organization, and that true leadership meant protecting others without seeking personal recognition had become foundational to how America approached civilian infrastructure security. Her final lesson to each graduating class at the Institute reflected the wisdom she had gained through her journey from decorated general to general to anonymous custodian to nationally recognized expert in civilian protection. Service is not about the uniform you wear or the title you hold, she would tell them as they prepared to return to hospitals, emergency agencies, and federal organizations around the world. Service is about using whatever skills and knowledge you have to protect people who depend on you. Regardless of whether anyone ever knows your name or acknowledges your contribution. The photograph that hung in her office showed not her military commendations or federal recognition, but a simple image of the Riverside Medical Center custodial staff, including herself in her blue uniform, taken during a shift change 3 years earlier. Below the photograph, inscribed on a simple brass plate, were the words that had become the Institute's motto: true preparedness begins with understanding that every role matters, every person counts, and every act of service honors those who depend on us. The quiet custodial worker who had once mopped floors in anonymity had become a symbol of how hidden service could transform both individuals and institutions. But she had never forgotten that the most important victories were measured not in recognition or advancement, but in the lives protected and the communities strengthened through the application of knowledge, compassion, and unwavering dedication to others. In pediatric wards across the country, custodial workers now moved through their rounds with a different understanding of their role, knowing that their work contributed to something larger than cleaning and maintenance. They were part of a comprehensive approach to civilian protection that recognized every person's contribution to the safety and welfare of the most vulnerable members of society. The General had found her final mission, and it would continue long after her own service had ended, carried forward by thousands of medical professionals who understood that preparedness, compassion, and hidden heroism were not contradictory but complementary elements of truly effective service to others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.